All right, good evening. Thank you everybody for coming. My name is Jennifer Macias and I work for Colorado Humanities. I am the history programs coordinator there, and I am so thankful to the library and to this beautiful center for hosting one of our Black History Live tour stops. Our wonderful scholar, Becky Stone, is doing 11 performances over the next 2 weeks. So she has got her work cut out for her, but having already watched this, I was just telling somebody that even though I'm going to be on my third time tonight, every time is like a brand new time for me. She does something different. She mentions something. It's just such a wonderful opportunity. So thank you for having us. Similarly, Canyon City is gorgeous. I had never been here. We had a chance to go see the bridge. And then, of course, I was mentioning how Western towns are just wonderful because the downtowns look so similar with the beautiful historic buildings. So it was great to be here. For those of you that may not know, Colorado Humanities is a nonprofit organization. We're affiliated and funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Every state has a Humanities Council, and we are able to offer these opportunities because of the funding that is available to make sure that programs within different components like history are available to everybody. So that I hope that you guys have an opportunity to enjoy the program. I handed out an evaluation to you as well. If you'll do me a favor and fill that out, I'll grab it for you at the end. If I didn't give you one, I'll make sure that I'll grab one for you, but that gives us a chance to know what you think, and if there's another person or a historical character that you would love for us to bring at some point, please let me know. We would love to make that happen. If you have never been to a Chautauqua performance, Chautauqua is a first-person dramatization of a historical figure. Our wonderful performer, Becky Stone, will be here as Josephine Baker. Her performance lasts about 45 minutes, and when she's done in character, she will do Q&A as Josephine Baker. And that's probably one of my favorite parts because you can ask her questions, and she's so incredibly knowledgeable about Josephine, she answers them back as Josephine. I'll then kind of come up and take a little bit of a break from that and let you know that Becky Stone is here, and she can answer questions for you just as her role as a performer. Becky Stone has a bachelor's in drama from Vassar College and a master's from Villanova University in elementary educational counseling. She was born and raised in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but she became a storyteller when she moved to the South over 30 years ago. She is here with us today, then, to talk about Josephine Baker, or to essentially embody Josephine Baker. So if you will indulge with me here for a moment. She opens up today in 1965, sharing with us her experiences about navigating race relations across not just the United States, but really across the world. So help me welcome Josephine Baker to the stage.
Good evening. Good evening, and thank you for such a warm welcome. I do appreciate it. I do not always receive such a warm welcome, even from my own people. And when I say my own people, I mean the Negro race. You see, they can be judgmental, and there are some things for which they criticize me about my lifestyle. They believe, some, that I am not a Christian, and that is very important to many people. But I am a Christian. I pray to God every night before I go to bed, and I also pray, as I did just now, before every performance and presentation. Sometimes my people feel that I have abandoned them, that I have become too highfalutin. I've gone to France and become a French citizen, and I am a French citizen, and not an American citizen. But that is not my choice. That was by the law. You see, if an American woman marries a foreign man, then she is automatically stripped of her American citizenship. If an American man marries a foreign woman, he gets to keep his citizenship, and his wife has the opportunity to become an American citizen. Well, I married two Frenchmen, not at the same time, but when I married Jean Lyon in 1937, I lost my American citizenship. So I feel that I am still an American, and I still identify as an American Negro. I was born here in St. Louis, Missouri in 1906. And anyone who knows me from that time in my life still calls me by my nickname, Tumpy. My mother, as soon as she saw me, called me Tumpy. It had something to do with Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. I guess she thought I looked like a cracked egg. But she was a laundress. And my father, to be honest, I do not know who my father is. And that is a secret my mother kept and took with her to the grave. But we were poor, and I was the first of 4 children. And eventually my mother married Arthur Martin, who was the father of the other 3, and he is a good man. He took good care of us and put up with my mother. But we were poor. And I, being the firstborn, I just don't think that my mother was ready for me, you know? As soon as she was able, she hired me out to white people in the community where I lived basically as a slave. And when my employers became unhappy with me, they sent me back to her. Now, the second time that happened, I was old enough to help my mother work and to take care of the 3 who came behind me. And so I stayed with my mother, helped her with her laundry business, did errands, went out into the white neighborhood and found odd jobs that I could do for a nickel, 10 cents, maybe a quarter. And I rarely went to school. But where you could find me almost every day was at 23rd and Market Street at the Booker T. Washington Theater, where I would sit in the dark and see on stage beautiful, funny, delightful stories, the very best that our race had to offer, because they were coming to our theater. And I could leave the reality of being a poor and unhappy Black child outside the theater. The theater became my refuge. I would watch and just submerge myself into that reality. I learned every word of every routine, every song. I learned all the dances. I could do it all. I could do their funny faces and cross my eyes, and I could do the chicken walk. And I could dance. Oh, I loved it. And I would take it home and perform for my siblings and the kids in the neighborhood. How I wanted that to be my reality. Because reality was not such a happy thing. I was 11 years old when there were those riots just across the river from us in East St. Louis, Illinois. I don't know how or why they started, but for 3 days, the white people in that community attacked every Negro they saw. They were dragging them off of trolleys and buses and beating them. White women and children were armed with bats and rakes and hoes and would attack any colored person they saw along the street. At night, I could see the fires across the river. They were setting fire to the homes. Some of them were only boxcars. So you know how poor these people were if they're living in abandoned boxcars. But they would set fire to the shacks or the boxcars, and as families ran out to escape the fire, there would be men waiting there with guns to mow them down. People tried to escape, of course. They ran to the Eads Bridge, and our home was near that Eads Bridge, and they tried to swim across the river when the police closed that bridge. The police were there, but they did nothing to help us. Help us. Well, to help our race, those things did not happen to me, but for so much of my life, I really believed that they had happened to me. Because we on the other side of the river would take in those who could have managed to escape. And our family took in several people and a whole family, and I sat there as an 11-year-old, having seen and heard the chaos that was happening across the river, and then they would bring these terrible stories of brutality and fear and terror. I thought that I had lived those things. It was such a traumatic and vivid part of my childhood. So, when I had the chance to escape that kind of reality in St. Louis, I took it. You see, I was there for a performance at the Booker Washington Theater when I heard Mr. Russell, the producer, say that the troupe was going to leave that night and continue their tour in Memphis, Tennessee. And I asked him if I could go with them. I could be in the chorus. I knew all the steps, and I could do everything they could do. But I wasn't good enough. But luckily, Clara Smith, the headliner, took a liking to me. And she had Mr. Russell hire me as her dresser and companion. And so I left with them that night after the show with just the clothes on my back. I was 13 years old, and my show business career had begun. Oh, I was living my dream. But it was not as pleasant a reality as I hoped. Life was difficult on the road. You see, all the directors and theater owners were organized. They were members of the Theater Owners Booking Association. And we were all traveling and performing on the TOBA circuit. But all of us performers understood that TOBA stood for Tough on Black Asses. It was so hard just to travel. We did not always travel comfortably. We did not always have a place to stay. We were not always paid what we expected to be paid. But we were in show business. And finally, I got my break. There was a chorus girl who could not go on that night. And believe me, she was really sick if she was not going to go on that night. But I told Mr. Russell that I knew the whole show, and he let me substitute that night. So I got out there and did the little dances that everyone was supposed to do. And then as we were making our exit, I was at the end of the line. I couldn't resist the audience. The music just filled me. And I started to do all those things I was doing as a kid. I was making funny faces and dancing off and making the audience laugh. And they loved me. And Mr. Russell loved that they loved me. So he hired me as the comic chorus girl. I was finally on stage. Of course, I had wanted to be a member of the chorus, but I was too tall and too brown-skinned to be in the chorus, because chorus line girls, what they wanted were small, delicate, petite, very fair-skinned Negro women, and I just didn't fit that description. But I could be at the end and be the comic. And eventually, I went from show to show, and I became a featured performer, a comédienne. And that's what I was doing in New York when Caroline Dudley Reagan saw me. Now, Caroline was married to an American who was serving in the French diplomatic corps. He was an American diplomatic corps serving in Paris, France. And this was in the 1920s. And Caroline knew that all of the French had just gone crazy for all things Africaine. They thought we were exotic. And they loved le jazz hot, the Charleston, and ragtime. And so Caroline wanted a project of her own. She came back to the United States, went to New York City, and decided that she was going to put together an all-Negro show and take it back to Paris. La Revue Nègre, the Negro Review. And she saw me and cast me as the star of the show. Well, we prepared the show. It was written and the music was written, and we rehearsed in New York. And then we were about to take our show to Paris, France. And any misgivings we had about taking our show to a country where we did not even speak the language, well, those misgivings just flew out the window the moment we stepped off the boat. We could walk anywhere without fear. We could stay in any hotel. We could eat in any restaurant. We could go shopping in any store and try on the clothes. They embraced us. They loved us in a way our own country never did. And that was before the show had opened. Well, the opening of La Revue Nègre was almost a disaster. Oh, my goodness. And that was my fault. You see, the night before the opening, I straightened my hair as usual. I put the chemicals in, and then after a while, you wash it out, and then you can style your straight hair. Well, I put the chemicals in, and then I fell asleep. And I woke up several hours later, I think. But my head was burning. Oh, I don't remember a pain that was as terrible as that pain was. I wanted to rip my head off, cut it off. I saw a window, and I wanted to run and jump out the window to end the pain. But some other cast members grabbed me and pulled me back, dragged me into a tub, and washed all the chemicals off my head and calmed me down. And then they called Caroline. And she came and took one look at me and took me to her personal hairdresser, Antoine. And Antoine looked at me and he said, "There's nothing I can do. There's not a hair left." But then Antoine had an idea. He got some black paint and he painted my bald head black, so that it looked like a hairdo with little spit curls framing my face. And then he got some lacquer and put 3 coats of lacquer on that black paint. So it looked like I had a very shiny, very short hairdo. And that's how I went on stage that night. It was the first time anyone in France had seen me on stage, and that became my signature hairdo. And they loved the show, and they loved me. And we played to sold-out audiences for the rest of the run. And every night in my dressing room, there were all sorts of friends and admirers who would take me out to dinner after the show, and then we'd wander into a little cabaret, and there would be another audience that I could not resist. So I would sing and dance the whole night, and then we'd go out and have a light breakfast in the morning, and I'd get back to my room at about 10 in the morning. And then I'd sleep all day until it was time to get up and do the show again that night. And after the show, we would go out and have that wonderful nightlife. This went on night after night for weeks, and I loved it. I was only 19 years old, and I could do that then. So after the run ended in Paris, we went on to Berlin. And there, we had the same wonderful reception. But one night after the show, one of the people who came into my dressing room was Monsieur Paul Derval, a big theater producer, an impresario in Paris, France. And he asked me if I would be the star of his next show at the Folies Bergère, which is the cream of the crop, the top in theatrical entertainment in Paris. And how could I say no? So I left the show after Berlin, went back to Paris, and there on opening night I did my danse sauvage, and I also came out and did what became my signature dance, my banana skirt dance. I came out and did all my funny faces and all of my wiggling and jiggling in nothing but a string of beads and a little skirt of fake bananas around my hips. And that became my signature costume and dance. And if I thought I was popular after La Revue Nègre, after doing this at the Folies Bergère, oh, every night my dressing room was filled with friends and lovers and aristocrats and diplomats and military personnel, all kinds of politicians. I was living the high life. And my favorite of all those friends and lovers was Pepito, Count Giuseppe Albertino. He stole my heart and took over my life and my career. And he was the one who said, "Josephine, no more. No more of this buffoonery you are doing on stage. You are to be une grande dame du théâtre, a grand lady of the theater." So he hired a countess to teach me proper French and proper English, to teach me how to write, all the proper etiquette so that I would know which fork and spoon to use and what the finger bowl was for rather than drinking it, which I first did when I first came to Paris, France. And she also taught me how to have pleasant conversation, social conversation with all of these sophisticated people that I was out with every night. He had new songs written for me, and new dances choreographed, and new costumes. I was wearing long, elegant gowns, Dior, Chanel, Balenciaga, Balmain, Poiret. And then he arranged a tour of 27 countries around the world. And by the time we came back to Paris, I was an international star. Now, Pepito said, there is another place we need to conquer, the United States of America. Oh, and I so wanted to come back home a success. Well, he arranged for me to be a co-star at the Ziegfeld Follies. Everyone understood that Fanny Brice was the star of the Ziegfeld Follies, but I was to be listed just under her name in big letters. And when we got to New York, all the posters we saw said Ziegfeld Follies, Fanny Brice. And then in very small letters, farther down the poster, it said, with Bob Hope and Josephine Baker. Third billing. I was terribly upset, but I didn't see that the first night. No, the first night I was terribly upset because we went to the Waldorf at Astoria where Pepito had made reservations, and I was outside making sure that my 70 bags of Louis Vuitton luggage was being cared for properly. And when I walked in behind Pepito, they said, Count, you may stay here, but your wife may not. So that night, we went to a total of 9 of the finest hotels in Manhattan, and I was refused at every one. I spent that night with Mickey Sawada, a good friend that I had made in Paris, but who was in New York at that time. And we found modest accommodations for me in Harlem. I was terribly upset about that. But the worst was that the way they organize shows in New York. I was used to collaborating with the directors and the musicians and the choreographers. Oh my goodness, my English is leaving me. But at any rate, that was not the way those follies worked. Half of my suitcases were filled with the gowns that I use as costumes wherever I perform. But they did not want to use any of my costumes. They had their own plans, and I had to do what they said. They wanted me to do the banana dance again. So I had to learn their choreography and wear their costume. I understood that I was to wear a bra in New York City, but the bra they had me wear had these metallic cones that stuck out from my breast. And the same kind of little spiky cones instead of bananas all around my hips. It was hideous. And I felt terrible, I looked terrible, and I brought in terrible reviews. I could not wait to get back home to Paris. And I did not come back to the United States for 20 years. I had a different agent at that point, and I had been touring in South America, and he had arranged for me to do the Copa City Club in Miami. We were negotiating with Ned Schuyler about the things that I would need. He was the owner of the club. And I said, I'm assuming that my people will be able to be there in the audience and I can perform for them, finally. And he laughed and said, oh, Miss Becker, this is the United States of America and this is the South. No Negroes have ever come into our city club. And I said, well, I will not perform where my people will not be able to see me perform. And we argued back and forth, and finally he agreed. He signed. He was confident that no Negroes would attend where they had not been allowed before. But they came. They came to see me. And the white people came as well. And I had demanded this. If we were to have Negroes and whites in the audience, they were not to be segregated. They could sit anywhere they wanted, next to anyone they wanted, and they did it. And everyone had a great time. And the show, of course, sold out every night, and Ned took over the rest of my tour and arranged for me to go all over the United States with that same stipulation. And finally, my people saw me as a hero. I was fighting for their civil rights and demanding it, and my demands were being met. Wherever I go, on any tour, anywhere, I make a point of getting to know the people that live there. I go out and visit the hospitals and the orphanages. I go out to the villages. It helps me understand the people I'm performing for. And it warms my heart because they get so excited to have me come out to them. So I did the same in our country. I went to Negro universities and schools and civic organizations. I spoke. I started doing benefits for the NAACP. In 1951, Harlem had a Josephine Baker Day, big parades and balls and luncheons, and I was finally accepted. And of course, the pinnacle, my most treasured memory, was getting to speak at the March in Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. But we had to make it through the 50s at first. After I finished that tour, 52, 53, somewhere in there, I continued working and touring around the countries in South America, in Africa, North Africa, in the Middle East, and Asia, and everywhere. The war was over, and people in these third world countries were trying to decide between democracy and communism. And wherever I went, when I was interviewed or out making lectures or speeches, I let them know what race relations were like in our country. They needed to know the truth, that this champion of democracy could not guarantee the rights of all of their citizens. And the United States government was interested in shutting me up. But they couldn't deny my passport or throw me in jail or anything. I was not an American citizen by their decree. But they harassed me as best they could. They brought diplomatic pressure on various countries, and I lost work because of that. If I ever dared to land in the United States, which I did once in New York on my way to Mexico, and they detained me 4 hours I sat in a New York airport and was grilled, and they went through all of my suitcases, and then they let me go. They never apologized or explained why. There was all this stuff going on here with anti-communism and Senator Joseph McCarthy. And Walter Winchell, a man I thought was my friend, reported me to J. Edgar Hoover because he said I was a communist, that I was rubbing elbows with all kinds of communist leaders around the world, which was true, of course. I don't let political stands interfere with personal relationships, friendships. But I am not a communist. Have you seen the way they dress in Moscow? No. J. Edgar Hoover did not find a thing on me. But it has been a struggle. And it continues to be a struggle, race relations in this country. I was so hopeful when I spoke to all those hundreds of thousands of people just a few years ago, gathering at the Washington Monument and Lincoln Memorial down that grand, great greenway. I went there in my French uniform, displaying my medals. After World War II, because I was part of the French resistance and I spied for the French and the Allies, they gave me 3 medals: the Croix de Guerre, the Cross of War, la Médaille de Résistance, the Resistance Medal, and I was made a knight, un chevalier de Légion d'honneur, of the Legion of Honor. And so I wore these medals as I spoke to those hundreds of thousands of people. Not because I wanted to flaunt the fact that I was an honored French citizen, but to let them all see that I'm more than an entertainer, than a singer and dancer. And I have hopes for this country and for the world that all races and ethnic and religious backgrounds can live together in peace. And I've tried to demonstrate it with my husband, Joe Bouillon. He and I agreed to adopt some children because I cannot have my own. We were to adopt a white baby, a brown baby, a red baby, and a yellow baby, and raise them in harmony together. And we announced it to the press, and that word was spread all over the world, so that Miki Sawada, who had returned to Japan after World War II, she had opened an orphanage. And she wrote to me and said, "Josephine, I hear you are touring Japan next. Come, I am sure that I have a child you will want to adopt to begin your international family." So I toured Japan and went to her orphanage. And when I got off the plane in Paris, Joe was there to greet me. And I had on each hip a small boy. And Joe said, "Josephine, which one is ours?" And I said, "Both." He was livid. "Josephine, we have already gone over our limit by having 2 yellow babies." But he is such a saint. He accepted and adopted them both. And the 10 others who came after, we call them our rainbow tribe. And they are doing beautifully. And I have hopes of having a university of brotherhood as well, because it is possible for all of us to live together and love each other. It's been a terrible conflict in my life. Ever since I left this country at the age of 19. How could I not love France that embraced me the way my own country did not? And how could I not love my country? Because it is my home, my family's home, where I am most comfortable, except for race relations. Early in my career, some friends wrote a song just for me. It has become my signature song about this conflict in my heart, this tearing apart, these two loves that I have. And that's what they call it. J'ai deux amours. I have two loves. Mon pays, my country, here, et Paris, Paris. And ma savane, my country, is beautiful, but how can I deny that I love Paris, Paris entier, completely, all of Paris. And I would like to sing just a little bit of it for you right now, because it so captures this theme in my life. J'ai deux amours, mon pays est Paris. Par toujours, mon cœur est ravi. Ma savane est belle, mais à quoi bon le nier? Ce qui m'ensorcelle, c'est Paris tout entier. Je vois un jour mon rêve joli. J'ai deux amours. Mon pays est Paris. J'ai deux amours. Mon pays est Paris. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Now, if there are any questions or any comments about what I've shared with you, there may be some questions about some things that I've not talked about at all, that maybe you have heard about my lifestyle. But I will try to be honest as I answer your questions. Oh, I'm sorry?
I'm going to come around and let you.
Do you still have a banana skirt?
The original banana skirt? No, I do not. But I have a replica that they made for me at the Folies Bergères. And it is at my home. Les Milandes is my chateau in Dordogne. It's southeast France. Do I wear it? No, not anymore. Actually, to be honest, I'm quite known for not wearing any clothes at all.
Were you in Paris during World War II, and what did you do in the war effort?
Okay. Yes, I certainly was in Paris during World War II and before France was invaded. And as soon as the other bordering countries began to fall to the Nazis, the French made a line, a military line, the Maginot Line, where they were going to make a stand. And I would go out there and help as best I could. And I could help in Paris. So many refugees were coming from those other countries. So I would go after a show and go visit people, do nursing duties that they would allow me to do. I certainly don't have any medical background, but I was very much involved. And of course, when the Maginot Line was crossed, I left Paris. But by that time, really, I had been recruited as an honorary correspondent, which is what they called their volunteer spies. It would be the best word to describe us. We were all aristocratic, sophisticated people who lived high on the hog and had social contacts with military and political leaders throughout Europe. They were, you know, folks that you partied with. And so one of them knew the French spy system was Deuxième Bureau. One of them suggested that they talk to me about being a spy. And once Jacques Abté, who was my mentor throughout the war, heard my passion for my new country and how determined and fearless I was, he recommended me, and I became a spy. And, you know, people would talk around me, as they always had. I don't know if it's just that they thought, oh, she's a woman and she's not really understanding what we're saying. But I was smarter than they thought, and also I had information from the Allies as to what information they needed. Then they needed to know what plans the Germans and the Italians were making, and Churchill especially needed that information. And so that was my primary role, was to get as much information as I could get and then get it to the people who needed it. And I could travel freely because I worked throughout World War II and until I was so sick I had to be hospitalized in Casablanca. But I worked, so I toured and I performed, and I was still a star, and no one suspected that I might be a spy, and they would not dare to check my body for any information. And Jacques Abté posed as my choreographer, and he would travel with sheet music on which I had written in invisible ink the information that they needed. And so he would often transport things. We went through Portugal and sometimes North Africa, but the English had ways of getting the information back to England, where Charles de Gaulle and, of course, Churchill needed that information. So, yes, I worked throughout the war and entertained the troops when my spy services were no longer needed, once they had, we, the Allies, had regained North Africa. I was able to entertain the Allied troops there. And I did that until the end, when I could go back to France. So thank you for that question.
Josephine.
Yes.
Ms. Baker. Do you go by Josephine Baker?
I do. You know, everyone in Europe calls me Josephine.
Josephine.
So, yes.
Oui. I'm talking to you from the future.
Ah,
Yeah,
I cannot see the future.
I know.
But perhaps
But I
you
can
can
see.
ask the person who will follow me on this stage, and she is free to talk about the future.
Oh, wonderful. Those of us who love to read, lately I've been finding a lot of either straight history or historical fiction, much of it having to do with the First and Second World Wars, and of people, so-called spies, resistance, and things like that. Do you have any recommendations of books about Josephine Baker and or her Paris in her time? when she was reigning supreme.
I have co-authored several books, but about my life, but they are all in French. And
Oh, quel
so
dommage.
I don't know, but I can't even remember the titles they were published under, but my co-author was Marcel Sauvage, and we wrote those books together. And you know, technically, I'm allowed to speak about my spy involvement, but through World War II, the French have an understanding that you cannot make that kind of information public in detail until 20 years, I believe it is, after the end of the war. So we are just at that borderline. And so, as far as I know, nothing has been written as yet.
Thank you very much.
I was just curious, in all of your world travels, in any other country that you went to, did you encounter anything near what you had to put up with in the United States as far as prejudice?
Okay. That is a good question. And the short answer to that is no. You know, there is racism everywhere. And sometimes, you know, it made a difference whether I was known when I would go out into villages or out into the city after the shows and that sort of thing. If they knew who I was, then they honored and respected that. But if they did not know who I was, and very often I would go out dressed in village garb. I did not always go out to explore cities dressed as Josephine Becker would be dressed. So, and then I would run into, you know, hostility and who do you think you are kind of wandering in here. But generally, there was nothing. I did not fear for my life the way many Negroes have to fear for their lives here in this country. If you cross over the line, in certain parts of this country, you're risking your life or your family's life. Okay, and there are two up here.
After the March on Washington, did you ever go back to the United States?
Oh, did I ever go back after the March on Washington? Yes, most definitely. And I have performed here in the States over the last 2 years. I've been on television and interviewed, but I can still tour in Europe to sold-out audiences for weeks at a time. And that does not happen here in the United States for me. No. I left when the Nazis came in and took over, and they took over my home, La Beauchesne. But I left. And there were many performers who stayed and entertained the Nazis. And the one with whom I really could not, I still cannot tolerate to be with him at all, and that is Maurice Chevalier. And certainly, you know, there are just certain lines that you need to draw, and he was not willing to draw it. He wined and dined with all of the Nazi generals and officers who had invaded and had taken over Paris, France. And he associated himself with the Vichy government, and I did not accept them as my government. I was for de Gaulle, you know, I was for him to be in control of our country.
What was Bob Hope like?
I'm sorry?
What was Bob Hope like?
Oh, what was Bob Hope like? We worked together. I feel as though he was very uncomfortable with my being in the show. I was the first and the last American Negro to be in the Ziegfeld, first American woman and the last Negro to be. Bert Williams had been in the Ziegfeld Follies, but I was the first Negro woman, and after me, there have been no others, no other Negroes. And he was definitely uncomfortable. You can sense that. But I tried to just breathe deeply and be as gracious as I normally am with my coworkers.
Would you like to do one more question for Josephine, if there are any in the audience?
This should be a really easy one. How long did you wear your hair varnished?
How long did I wear the painted hair?
Yeah.
My hair started to grow out, and after that I used a fixative that was just slapped onto my hair to make it very flat and shiny. And Pepito convinced me to market it, and it was called La Becaire. And, because other people wanted their hair slick and shiny and with little spit curls in the 20s. Oh, thank you. And thank you. Thank you.
We'll go ahead and take questions then for the performer, Becky Stone.
And I'm going to get a sip of water here.
And Becky, maybe if you'd like to start us off with answering the question about books that have been written about Josephine Baker.
The question from this lady over here, yes. I couldn't quite remember the question, but I knew that Becky Stone needed to answer it. There have been lots and lots of books written about Josephine Baker, and a lot of them were written in French. I have not read any of the French books. And only this past year did a book in English come out about her spy work. So that's the only book that I've read about that. And in her lifetime, she just said nothing about what her role was because she felt it was top secret stuff. So she would say, yes, I was a spy and I was an honorable correspondent, but she would not go into detail. So my telling you those things would not be what Josephine would say. But what I found of the books that were translated into English was there was this inconsistency with her stories about herself. And as I researched her over that first year and now into these recent years by reading interviews and other books that might have just a chapter or two about her, is that I was a little worried about doing her because she didn't always tell the truth about what her life experience was. For me to tell you that she was not in those riots, for many biographies or interviews, she would say, they burned our house and my grandmother grabbed me and took me out and, she would just make up these stories. And she might tell the same story, but it would be different places where I'd read it. So I came to depend on this book that she did adopt, and she adopted a 13th child. Her husband did not adopt. He had adopted the other 12. But she adopted Jean-Claude Baker when he was 14, and she kind of co-parented him with his mother, a single mom who was poor and had raised him. And he is viewed by the other 12 as a sibling because he filled that role. He took care of their mother. They were making their own lives, and Joe had divorced and was in Argentina. So Jean-Claude took care of her. And he wrote a book about her, which is called Josephine, the Hungry Heart. And I have it backstage, but that is the title, co-written with Chris Chase. But his name is Jean-Claude Baker, because he took her name. And he did the research that I wish I could have done. And he wrote the book in his voice, where he would sometimes, in very straight narrative, say, this is what happened. But sometimes he will talk to his mother in the book, and he'll say, Mother, you always told me such and such and such a thing. But when I talked to your brother, this is what he said. Or when I interviewed your roommate when you were touring with, some show. So he did, and this was right after she had died. She was 60, about to turn 69 when she died. So these people were still alive, and he could still talk to them. And I just find his book the most reliable of the books that I've read about her. But I think since his book came out, and it would be, maybe the book is like 25 years old, since it's been first published, something like that. But there's other material on her that is good, but I have yet to read an entire book that is about her, that's as reliable as his is. And even I found discrepancies even in this spy book that just came out last year, because he will, go off on sidetracks about her earlier life, and just, just wasn't the truth. Just would be the general idea, but it just wasn't the truth. So, oh, yes. Oh, right.
Have you seen the PBS special on Josephine Baker?
No, I haven't. Oh, okay. And I really do want to see it.
I wanted your opinion on it.
Right. And I wasn't aware of it really until I came on this tour, and I haven't had a chance to look at it since I've been traveling, so. Oh. Well, we'll see, anyone who goes through the trouble of making a movie wants to sell the movie and make a good story.
I hope you do, because there's a lot of original footage in it, a lot.
Oh, yes.
And that's what I wanted to ask you about.
I have seen quite a bit of footage of her performing. The TV spots that she did when she was accepted and welcomed here, and little clips of performances of the banana skirt dance, the original banana skirt dance. I haven't found it in its entirety, but I've seen more than 2 minutes of it, her making the entrance down this ramp on this stage and doing this dancing. I've seen, and when I've done a workshop on her, I often show those clips, because that's when I realize she herself will say, I don't exercise, I've never been a trained dancer. And you look at her dancing, and it's not the dancing of a trained dancer, it's just not quite up to snuff. So, and I have copies of the 3 French films that she made, and I like them because I see her and I go, oh, she's so cute, oh, you know. But I know that they're not great movies, and they didn't do well, you know. They didn't do well. Oh, I'm sorry?
Your Charleston steps, how did you learn that?
Oh, everybody who teaches the Charleston now. And I don't do them well because you're supposed to be turning your feet like that with every step. My mother would taught me to do this, and you know, and my mother and I would kind of do it like this. Josephine would be like this, you know, and doing it. She had incredibly rubber legs, and you know, but a lot of people teach the Charleston as just part of modern dance classes and that kind of thing. It's a hard dance to do well. But, you know, it was a social dance. Everybody was doing the Charleston, you know. And, you know, you see professional dancers doing the dance in the 40s, swing dancing and taking the girls and, you know, everybody was doing it. But when you see professionals do it, it's amazing. It is amazing. But every kid was doing it, yeah. Yes? Me, Becky Stone, yes. I live just outside of Asheville in western North Carolina near the Smokies. And I grew up in Philadelphia, yeah. And, you know, talk about having friends in high places. When Josephine died, I don't know, three days maybe after she did yet another comeback. Every time she needed money, she would do a comeback farewell tour. And the last one she did, you know, she was 68. And even before that, people would say, you know, oh, it's going to be terrible, you know, she'll be awful. Because she never lost her figure. But you can see, you know, the age in her face and under her eyes. And she covered it up with makeup. She did all sorts of colors and put sequins. I thought, oh, wow, she was ahead of her time, putting little sequins to hide the bags under her eyes. But she opened at the Bobino in Paris and got rave reviews. And Jean-Claude was not with her, and he feels kind of guilty because he would have made sure she had her medication before she went to bed that night. And I don't have a full understanding of the kind of medication she needed, but she died at the hospital. She passed into some kind of coma the next morning and went to the hospital and died. So, but huge funeral and thousands of people. But she was living at that point, she lost her chateau. She was living at that point in Monaco because Princess Grace was one of her friends and came to her rescue when she lost her chateau and said, Josephine, come, I have a small villa, you know, where you can live with a few of the kids who were still at home. And after the big Paris funeral that Princess Monaco and her Prince Rainier attended, she had a second funeral for her in Monaco that she thought was more dignified and appropriate for Josephine, and she buried her there. And just, we're 23, and November of 2021, the French inducted her into the Pantheon, which is the highest honor. And, you know, there are political reasons for doing it at that time, but still, the legislature, you know, responded to the petition and inducted her into the Pantheon. And the family can choose whether to move the remains to the Pantheon or to leave them where they are. So she is still, they chose to leave her still in Monaco, where with her husband, her divorced husband, Joe Bouillon, who had adopted all those children with her, is buried there with her, and her mother is there.
For one more question, and then if you'd love to ask any questions after Becky.
Yes, one-on-one.
Happy to
I'm happy
answer.
to stay. So.
Do you have any plans to show this in France? To do this show in France?
No, what a compliment. Thank you. But no, I don't have any plans to portray Josephine, and I'm hoping that they come out with a French film about her. It'd be interesting. It'd be interesting to compare how the French see her at this point and how it contrasts to what the American films are like. I will say that I did read in reading, doing this research, that the French still call her Josephine, and if they say Josephine, they're either talking about Napoleon's wife or Josephine Baker. They're either talking about an empress or a poor black girl from St. Louis, Missouri. And when I went to consult with some French people who live in Asheville to prepare for this, the man said at the end of my pulling information out of his wife, he'd watched the whole thing, and then he said, totally unprompted, when we say Josephine, we are either talking about Napoleon's wife or Josephine Baker. We all call her Josephine. And I what could I say? I certainly wasn't going, I know that because I read it somewhere, but it's the truth. That's how they love her. So.
All right, thank you everybody for coming out. Thank you, Becky.
Great, thank you. And I thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you.